The bouncer's laughter echoed down the bustling city street, nearly making him drop his clipboard. Before him stood an elderly man, dressed in a faded jacket and scuffed shoes, politely requesting entry to one of the most exclusive nightclubs in town. The flashing lights, booming music, and sleekly dressed crowd behind the velvet rope made it clear. This was no place for someone who looked like he belonged on a bus bench. The bouncer shook his head in disbelief, ready to turn the old man away. But the old man didn't flinch. Instead, he stood tall, his posture steady and calm, as if waiting wasn't a burden but a right he had earned long ago. His eyes didn't waver, even under the bouncer's amused gaze. Something about his quiet confidence made the bouncer hesitate, though he still didn't know why. What no one on that crowded street could have guessed was what was happening inside the club. Amid the flashing lights and swirling smoke, a man with stars on his shoulders sat patiently. A Navy Admiral, respected and powerful, had been searching for that same old man for over 40 years, waiting for this exact moment. And in a matter of seconds, the bouncer's smirk would vanish as the doors swung open, and a reunion decades in the making would unfold, changing everyone's understanding of respect, loyalty, and honor. Welcome to the Silent Ranks. Before we continue with this incredible story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories about respect and recognition deserve to be heard, please hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being part of this journey. The club was called Meridian, tucked between glass towers in the heart of downtown, where money flowed like water and exclusivity was the only currency that mattered. On Friday nights, the line stretched around the corner. Young professionals in $1,000 suits waited behind red ropes, hoping the bouncer would find them worthy. Tonight was no different. The bass line from inside rattled windows 3 blocks away, and the neon sign cast purple shadows across faces eager to be seen. Marcus Stone had worked the door for 8 years. He knew the rules better than anyone. Designer clothes, expensive watches, the right attitude, and preferably youth. Lots of youth. At 6'4" with arms like tree trunks, he decided who belonged and who didn't with a glance. He'd turned away celebrities who weren't dressed right, politicians who didn't tip enough, and countless ordinary people who thought money alone would get them inside. He took pride in being the gatekeeper to a world most people would never touch. The evening had been routine until the old man appeared. Marcus first noticed him standing at the edge of the crowd, not pushing forward like the others, just watching. He wore a navy blue jacket that had seen better decades, khaki pants that were clean but worn, and shoes that told stories of long walks on hard ground. His gray hair was neatly combed, his posture straight despite his age, but everything about him screamed ordinary. Unremarkable. Forgettable. Most people in his position would have taken one look at the scene and walked away. But this man did something different. He approached the rope calmly, hands at his sides, and waited. Not with the desperate eagerness of someone hoping to get lucky, but with the patience of someone who had waited for far more important things than nightclub entry. Marcus barely looked up from his clipboard when the old man stepped forward. The request came quietly, almost politely. He wanted to go inside. Not for a drink, not for the music, but to find someone. Someone important. Someone who might be looking for him too. The bouncer's reaction was immediate and predictable. Laughter. Deep, dismissive laughter that turned heads in the waiting crowd. A few people joined in, sensing entertainment. Someone pulled out a phone to record. The old man became the night's unexpected comedy, standing there in his thrift store clothes asking to enter a place where bottle service started at $300. Marcus wiped his eyes, still chuckling as he looked the old man over again. He asked if this was some kind of joke, if maybe he was lost, if he needed directions to a diner or a library somewhere more his speed. The crowd behind the rope snickered. A woman in a cocktail dress whispered something to her friend, and they both laughed. The old man absorbed it all without flinching, his expression unchanged. But he didn't leave. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something that made Marcus pause mid-laugh. It was a photograph, creased and faded, showing 2 men in naval uniforms standing on what looked like the deck of a ship. One was clearly the old man, decades younger with the same steady eyes. The other was someone Marcus didn't recognize, but the old man held the photo like it contained his entire reason for being there. He explained, in a voice that carried despite being soft, that he was looking for his former commanding officer. They had served together long ago, and he had reason to believe the man might be inside tonight. It wasn't about the drinks or the scene. It was about something unfinished, something that couldn't wait any longer. Marcus glanced at the photo, then at the old man's face, then back at the growing crowd of impatient clubgoers behind him. His job was simple: keep the wrong people out. Everything about this situation screamed wrong people. He handed the photo back with a shake of his head, suggesting the old man try calling instead of showing up at nightclubs. The laughter started again, louder this time. Inside Meridian, past the pounding music and swirling lights, Admiral James Mitchell sat in a private booth overlooking the main floor. At 68, he was older than most of the clientele, but his presence commanded a respect that had nothing to do with dress codes. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, his silver hair immaculate, his bearing unmistakably military, even in civilian clothes. He came here occasionally, not for the scene, but for the quiet corner where he could think without interruption. Tonight, something had drawn him to the window. Maybe it was the commotion outside, or maybe it was the instinct that had kept him alive through 3 decades of naval service. He found himself watching the crowd at the entrance, his eyes scanning faces with the systematic attention of someone trained to notice details others missed. And then he saw him, standing beyond the red rope, being mocked by a bouncer twice his size, was a face Admiral Mitchell had been hoping to find for over 40 years. The posture was unmistakable, even after all this time. The way he stood at attention without trying, the calm in his eyes despite being humiliated, the dignity that no amount of ridicule could touch. Petty Officer First Class Robert Chun, the man who had saved Mitchell's life and the lives of 18 other sailors during a storm in the South China Sea in 1983. The man who had disappeared from Mitchell's world after discharge, leaving behind only a memory of extraordinary courage and a debt that could never be repaid. Mitchell stood so quickly his drink toppled. He moved through the club like a man with singular purpose, past startled servers and confused patrons, toward the entrance where a crowd was still laughing at an old man's impossible request. The bouncer was in the middle of another joke when the club's front door opened and Admiral Mitchell stepped into the street. The change was immediate and electric. Mitchell's eyes locked onto Chin's across the crowd, and for a moment, 40 years collapsed into nothing. Recognition passed between them like a current, unspoken but absolute. Chin's shoulders straightened even more, if that was possible, and something that might have been relief flickered across his weathered features. Marcus noticed the well-dressed man approaching, but didn't immediately grasp the significance. He was still riding the wave of his comedy routine, still playing to his audience of amused onlookers. It wasn't until the man walked directly to the old man and extended his hand that Marcus began to understand something had shifted. The greeting was simple but loaded with meaning that only the two men fully understood. Mitchell called him by his rank and last name, as if no time had passed at all. Chen responded with equal formality, addressing Mitchell as commander, the rank he had held during their service together. The crowd fell silent, sensing something beyond their comprehension unfolding before them. Mitchell turned to Marcus with eyes that had commanded ships and men through decades of service. His voice carried authority that made the bouncer's earlier confidence evaporate like morning mist. He asked, with dangerous quiet, if there was a problem with his guest entering the establishment. Marcus, still holding his clipboard, looked between the two men with growing confusion. The Admiral's presence was unmistakable now, his bearing, his tone, the way he stood that left no doubt about who held power in this suddenly transformed situation. The bouncer's mouth opened and closed without sound, his earlier amusement replaced by the dawning horror of someone who realized they had made a terrible mistake. The story began to unfold in fragments as Mitchell, his voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence, told the crowd what they had just witnessed. He spoke of a storm that had nearly claimed an entire ship, of 24 hours when survival seemed impossible, and of one sailor who had refused to let his shipmates die. Chen had volunteered for a rescue mission that everyone, including himself, knew was likely suicide. He had gone into churning black water in conditions that had already killed 2 other rescue attempts. For 6 hours, Chen had battled waves that could crush steel, hypothermia that should have shut down his body, and exhaustion that would have broken most men in minutes. One by one, he had pulled his shipmates from certain death, making trip after trip into the storm until every soul was accounted for. 18 men owed their lives to the courage of the man the bouncer had been mocking moments before. Mitchell's voice grew quieter but more intense as he continued. He spoke of how Chun had never sought recognition, never filed the reports that would have brought him medals, never spoke of what he had done even when others tried to honor him. After discharge, he had simply disappeared into civilian life, carrying his heroism like a private burden too personal to share. The Admiral had been searching for him for decades, hoping to properly thank the man who had saved not just his life, but the lives of sailors who went on to have children, grandchildren, careers, and dreams that existed only because Robert Chun had refused to let them drown. The search had been frustrating and fruitless until tonight, when chance had brought them together outside a nightclub where one man's dignity was being used as entertainment for strangers. Marcus felt the weight of every eye on the street. The crowd that had been laughing minutes before now stared at him with expressions ranging from disgust to pity. His clipboard hung forgotten in his hand as he realized he had spent the evening humiliating a genuine American hero. The old man he had dismissed as irrelevant was a man whose courage had literally saved lives. The bouncer tried to speak, to apologize, to somehow undo the damage, but Admiral Mitchell raised a hand for silence. This wasn't about punishment or embarrassment. This was about recognition long overdue, about respect that should have been automatic, about understanding that heroism doesn't always wear the uniform people expect. Mitchell turned to Chun and, in full view of the crowd, the cameras, and the bouncer who had learned his lesson too late, rendered a salute that spoke of gratitude, respect, and the bond between men who had faced death together. Chun returned the salute with the precision of someone who had never forgotten his training, never lost his pride, never stopped being the sailor who had once risked everything for others. The crowd watched in absolute silence as the two men walked toward the club entrance. Marcus stepped aside without being asked, the red rope parting like water before them. No clipboard, no judgment, no questions about dress codes or age requirements. Just two men entering a building where one had spent the evening searching for the other. Inside, Admiral Mitchell led Chun to his private booth, away from the music and crowds, to a place where they could finally have the conversation that had been 40 years in the making. They talked about the storm, about the men who had survived, about the families those men had gone on to create. They talked about duty and sacrifice and the quiet heroism that happens when no one is watching. Chun learned that Mitchell had never forgotten, had never stopped feeling grateful, had never stopped believing that some debts can only be paid with a lifetime of searching. Mitchell learned that Chun had lived quietly but well, that he had raised children who became teachers and nurses and engineers, that his heroism had continued in smaller ways throughout a life dedicated to helping others without expecting recognition. As the evening wound down, as the club began to empty and the street grew quiet, the two men sat in comfortable silence. Outside, Marcus continued his job with a humility that hadn't been there before. The clipboard remained in his hand, but his eyes now looked for things beyond clothes and age and surface appearances. He had learned that heroes don't always announce themselves, that courage often wears ordinary clothes, and that respect should be the default rather than something to be earned through wealth or youth. The story of that night spread quickly through social media and local news. Videos of the Admiral's salute, of Chin's dignified response, of Marcus's transformation from mockery to shame, became symbols of larger truths about how we judge each other and what we value. The nightclub, perhaps recognizing the power of the moment, announced that veterans would always be welcome regardless of dress code or age. But for Chun and Mitchell, the real victory wasn't in the publicity or the change policies. It was in the completion of a circle that had been broken for 4 decades. It was in the knowledge that heroism, even when unrecognized, never loses its value. It was in the understanding that some meetings are worth waiting a lifetime to experience. Chun never became a regular at Meridian. That wasn't his world, and both men knew it. But he left that night with something he had carried incompletely for 40 years, the knowledge that his courage had been seen, remembered, and valued by the men whose lives he had saved. Mitchell left with something equally important, the chance to finally say thank you to the man who had made his life, and the lives of 17 others, possible. Marcus continued working the door, But his job changed that night in ways that went far beyond policy adjustments. He began to see each person who approached not as a potential problem, but as someone with a story he didn't know. He started conversations instead of making judgments. He learned that the well-dressed didn't always deserve respect any more than the poorly dressed deserved dismissal. The photograph Chun had carried, creased and faded from decades in his wallet, found a new home in Admiral Mitchell's study, where it sits alongside commendations and medals and other reminders of a life spent in service. But unlike the official recognitions, the photograph represents something more personal. The moment when two men found each other again in a world that had tried to keep them apart. Sometimes heroism doesn't ask for recognition. Sometimes it walks quietly through life, carrying its dignity like a private flame that illuminates only the path forward, never demanding attention or reward. Sometimes it stands patiently outside nightclubs, enduring mockery with the same strength that once endured storms, waiting not for fame, but for the simple acknowledgement that it existed at all. Robert Chun spent 40 years being an unrecognized hero. For most of that time, it didn't matter to him whether anyone remembered what he had done in those terrible hours at sea. What mattered was that he had done it, that 18 men had lived because he had been willing to die for them, that families had continued because one sailor had refused to let the ocean win. But recognition, when it finally comes, has its own power. Not the recognition of crowds or medals or newspaper headlines, but the recognition of the people who were there, who knew the truth, who carried the memory like a debt that could never be fully repaid. That kind of recognition doesn't make headlines, but it makes lives complete. Admiral Mitchell spent 40 years carrying gratitude like a weight he couldn't put down. Every promotion, every achievement, every moment of pride in his long career was shadowed by the knowledge that none of it would have been possible without one man's courage in a storm that should have killed them all. The search for Chun had become more than professional obligation. It had become personal mission, the completion of something that felt essential to his own peace. When they finally found each other outside that nightclub, when the Admiral rendered his salute and Chun returned it with precision that 40 years hadn't dulled, something settled in both men that had been restless for decades. The circle closed, the debt acknowledged, the heroism finally honored by the person whose opinion mattered most. Marcus learned something that night that changed not just how he did his job, but how he moved through the world. He learned that dignity doesn't always dress in expensive clothes, that courage doesn't always announce itself with fanfare, that respect should be offered freely rather than earned through performance. He learned that the person you dismiss might be the person whose story could teach you everything about what really matters. The bouncer who laughed at an old man's request became the bouncer who understood that every person approaching his door carried stories he couldn't see, achievements he couldn't measure, and dignity that didn't depend on his approval. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden, but it was real and lasting, the kind of change that ripples outward in ways that touch other lives in other moments. The nightclub where it all happened became something different too. Not because of policy changes or publicity, but because one night it hosted a moment of recognition that reminded everyone present that heroism exists in ordinary people, that courage doesn't expire with age, and that the most important stories are often the ones we almost miss because we're not paying attention to the right things. This story was brought to you by the Silent Ranks. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Someone whose quiet courage changed lives without fanfare, whose dignity remained unshaken even when others failed to see their worth. Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how their example continues to inspire the way you treat others. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.